Good morning, everyone. As Toby indicated, I'm the CRO for Durban. I just wanted to welcome up my deputy CRO to the podium and underscore the importance governance aspect we have around the CRO function in Durban. We felt that resilience was such an important element that we didn't want to invest that important portfolio just in one person. So in fact, we have a three-headed CRO in Durban. It's a bit like Cerberus at the gates of Hades, in order to distribute both the joy and the pain of being involved in this program. So I would like to welcome my CRO, Joe Douwes, who will give our presentation, but I also want to acknowledge our third head, Manisha Maganla or Hassan, who's known to some of you who couldn't make it here today, because she's an equally important part of the team. So I'll hand over to Joe for the substance.
Okay, well, morning everyone. So my job really is to give a little bit of context for Durban this morning. As you all, I'm sure, know, Durban is a city in South Africa. The municipal area is quite large, about 2,500 square kilometers, with a population estimated for 2017 to be in the order of about 3.7 million people. It's a city that faces a range of socio-economic challenges, high levels of poverty, high levels of inequality, and significant backlogs in terms of service delivery. And that ranges really from housing through to water, sanitation provision. And so really these significant socio-economic challenges mean that development and service delivery really are the political priorities in the city of Durban, and really drive how development happens in that space. Within that context, though, Durban has an incredible biodiversity asset. And so about a third of the municipal area is part of our Durban Metropolitan Open Space System. And so a key challenge for Durban really is how to integrate that environmental asset as a really key part of the city's future development path. Durban is located in one of 36 global biodiversity hotspots, which means it has a very high biodiversity, but also that biodiversity is under significant threat. And we've got a range of ecosystems, wetlands, grasslands, forests, all of which provide important ecosystem services, which have already been touched on this morning, but really ranging from water supply, flood attenuation, water purification, climate regulation, and the list goes on. And those are free services. And why that's really important in the Durban context is that budget resources are fairly stretched. And so those free resources free ecosystem services become incredibly important. They're also important because a large portion of the population still relies very directly on those ecosystem services, particularly in our rural areas. And so in Durban, there's a slow but growing understanding of the role of green infrastructure, not only in supporting traditional grey infrastructure, but also as a key component of the city's climate adaptation response. What's also important in the Durban context is that about 38% of the municipal area is rural or semi-rural, and so that is under communal land ownership, under traditional authority governance. And so there's an interesting thing that happens in the municipal area where there's a dual system of governance. On one hand, the more sort of city hall type governance where planning tools and regulations are more centralized and applied. And then the traditional forms of governance which occur in our rural areas where a lot of the land allocation and decisions that are made by traditional leaders. And so that means that there's less planning control in those spaces, and that comes with a number of challenges. Some of those are related to service delivery in those areas, but also because a significant portion of the city's environmental asset actually lies in our rural areas. So uncontrolled development or unplanned development potentially puts that at great risk. So what are some of the major threats to biodiversity in Durban, apart from this fragmented system of governance that operates? High levels of transformation, largely due to major development pressures. And that's really compounded by fairly low levels of protection and management of that open space asset. Unsustainable use of certain resources, so whether it's harvesting of products for timber, for medicinal use, and limited political support for environmental issues. And that's often because of the very strong socio-economic push for development in Durban. And a big challenge in terms of enforcement capacity. So a big municipal area, low capacity, creates significant challenges for biodiversity in Durban. So how has Durban responded to some of these challenges? A key and really foundational piece of work that frames how biodiversity is planned in the city is our Durban Metropolitan Open Space System, which essentially is an environmental layer. It covers about 78,000 hectares in the municipal area and is informed by a municipal systematic conservation assessment. And so that layer is a key part and is included in the hierarchy of spatial plans for the city and in the town planning scheme. So it's a really key input into how the city plans and thinks about its development. And any development that is proposed either within or adjacent to any of those open spaces requires some kind of comment or authorization. The city has also been very proactive since about 2002 in actively acquiring land for conservation purposes. Some of the other initiatives that run in Durban are biodiversity stewardship programs, really acknowledging the fact that a large portion of the open space system is under private or communal land ownership. And so there's a big need to begin building partnerships with landowners to try and incentivize and encourage biodiversity protection and management. In our communal areas, those stewardship programs often take the form of biodiversity agreements, with the ultimate objective of proclaiming nature reserves in those areas. And then other initiatives like supportive rates policies, rates rebates for land that has been zoned for conservation or that has some biodiversity value. And then Durban has also pioneered in South Africa the concept of an environmental special rating area. So really building on the concept of an urban improvement precinct, where additional rates are leveraged from landowners to then invest back into environmental management and protection. What we're seeing also in Durban is a shift and a growing focus on the need to try and integrate the biodiversity, climate change and development agendas. And the biggest scope for that is really in our big natural resource management program. So whether that's around invasive alien plant control, the big urban reforestation programs and so on. And this particular photograph is taken at our Buffels Dry Reforestation Project, which is an attempt to really rebuild an urban forest in a buffer site of a landfill. That program involves local communities in growing trees, in bartering those back to the project. And so there are a whole range of benefits that flow from that. Some of them obviously are biodiversity, some linked to climate change adaptation, and then a whole lot of socio-economic benefits linked to job creation and capacity development. Our Mgeni Ecological Infrastructure Partnership, which our colleague Duncan Hayes is more involved in, is also an example of where the city is quite proactively trying to look at ways to invest in ecological infrastructure as a key mechanism to ensure water security. The Mgeni is one of the important water supply catchments in Durban. It covers a large area, it crosses municipal boundaries, and so those kinds of initiatives require multi-stakeholder engagement and quite complex governance challenges inherent in that. So how does some of this link to Durban's resilience strategy? Durban has been on quite a long resilience journey with the intention of producing a strategy around April this year. And the natural environment has always been identified by our stakeholders as being a really foundational piece to Durban's resilience. But as we've moved through this journey, we've begun to narrow and concentrate our focus a little bit more. And where we're at the moment is really around focusing on two resilience building options, which we see as becoming the key pillars of the city's resilience strategy. The first resilience building option is around collaborative informal settlements action. So really acknowledging that in cities like Durban, informality is a key part of the urban fabric. And so how does one begin to think about that more creatively? How does one begin to partner with communities, with NGOs, to think differently about how to make those spaces more livable? And why that's important from an environmental perspective is that often those settlements are located in environmentally sensitive areas. And also because of the often poor service delivery in those spaces, there are a whole lot of environmental impacts that flow from them. And so better management could have a whole range of benefits, not only environmental, but also in terms of quality of life for the people that are living there. The second resilience building option really picks up on this issue of the dual governance system in Durban and is aiming to look at how we facilitate more integrated planning at that interface between municipal and traditional governance systems. Really with the intention and the hope that through doing that a whole range of benefits again will flow. Improved protection and management of the critical biodiversity assets that lie in traditional authority areas, but also just improved and integrated planning across these systems, which hopefully will have other resilience benefits. So finally, where are the gaps in Durban's work and where we're really hoping that this networking exchange will help us to learn from our other colleagues and cities? First really is around biodiversity strategy development. So how do we think more comprehensively about how we develop strategies for biodiversity in our cities, and really also trying to link to national goals, to international goals, which we mentioned earlier. Sustainable financing, so where the work of organizations like TNC becomes very important. How do we try and secure sustainable financing for these big ecological restoration programs that don't just draw on city finances and external donor sources of funding? How do we close the loop on those kinds of systems? How do we think more strategically about development offsets and really use that as an opportunity to secure environmental assets, not only in the short term, but in the long term? And how do we set up the management and finance mechanisms around those? How do we look at mechanisms to incentivize biodiversity protection? In Durban, obviously a key issue is in our traditional governance, traditional authority areas, but probably could be more broadly applied. And then very importantly, developing the science that underpins a lot of this work. So how do we really build the base from which we're working that better allows us to understand thresholds in key ecosystems, that helps us to quantify and better articulate the value that ecosystems provide, which hopefully then also helps us to communicate around that a lot better. And then finally around enforcement. So as I mentioned, enforcement capacity is a major challenge in Durban. How do we think more creatively about that in a resource-stretched environment and in a municipal area that is very large? Okay, thanks. I think my job is to hand over to Panoma.